how to play ace-king when you miss the flop. This first hand is a nice example. This extremely meticulous opponent decides to go ahead and open to 4.98. That is the only sizing that works, guys. All of the other sizes are bad. This is the GTO only option that you can do if you want to be a crusher. If you make it 4.97 or 4.99, I'll know that you're not a GTO expert, and I'll know that you're probably bad at poker. So this guy finds exactly the right sizing. Well done, villain. I'm being sarcastic. It doesn't really matter how big you go here. This is a bit pedantic. So we go to 22 bucks. Villain calls. Onto the flop of 5-6-3. This flop is going to eradicate and erode much of our pre-flop range advantage that we gained by 3-betting out of the small blind. So the fact that we had hands like aces, kings, queens, jacks does still matter, but it doesn't matter quite as much when there are 3 set making cards now available, creating 9 combos of sets that are in villain's range, but not our range. We don't go ahead and 3-bet out of the small blind with hands like 4s in this position, particularly frequently, or 3s or deuces or something, or 5s. So this is a board that allows villain to catch up in terms of equity and sort of neutralize the pre-flop range disadvantage that they suffered from. However, one good thing is that we do have a nut advantage here, so my main strategy in this spot would be that if I'm c-betting, I'm c-betting big, but I wouldn't c-bet very frequently. And that's because range advantage is the thing that makes us want to c-bet often in game theory, and that's not really present here anymore. However, we do still have the overpair advantage, and I know they're not technically the nuts, I'm saying nut advantage using this carrot poker school term, but the problem is that you shouldn't really obsess about the literal nuts. We call that the literal nuts fallacy, where students say, oh, well, sets are the nuts, so villain has the nut advantage. The thing is, at the stack to pot ratio, we're not that concerned with getting stacked by a set. If it happens, it happens. When we have kings and he has 6s, we're just supposed to lose a lot of money, so that's the way it's supposed to go. We decide to check this time. As I say, you can play ace king in so many different ways here. You can bet big, and if you do that, the hand is what I call a hybrid. It will be a value bet against certain hands that call, that it dominates. Villain will have to defend some ace-queen combos, backdoor clubs, 1 spade hands, things like just ace-queen of hearts that have a lot of showdown value against our range. He'll have to call a lot of hands that are worse than this and can showdown and we can win against. And moreover, he'll have to call some hands that we can actually dominate here. The other thing that I would say is that when you bet here, although villain doesn't really fold a better hand to like a B60, a 60% pot size bet, villain could definitely fold some hands that give us useful fold equity. Protection is not the be-all and end-all of poker. It's really not a huge deal, but it is a thing and it does matter to some extent. If your fold equity was fully useless here because villain's range was either something completely dominated or something that beat you, there'd be absolutely no sense in betting. But because villain's range does contain hands like queen 10, 10-9, jack 10, jack 9 suited, etc. perhaps, you're going to go ahead and harvest some useful fold equity when those hands fold. To answer this question of how should you play ace king when you miss this flop, you can bet big as a hybrid value bluff denial bet. You can check raise as a hybrid bluff value denial check raise, and you can also check call as a showdown value bluff catcher. This is a very nice bluff catcher on the flop because it dominates some bluffs. It has implied odds when both players bink a turn, you know, he hits king queen but we've got ace king and we stack him, that sort of thing. And it also does another thing that's really nice here, which is it gives us the chance to redraw against villain's value range. So when you have the kind of bluff catcher that can redraw against the value bet but can also just hold up really well against the bluffing range and dominate those bluffs, you have a really strong bluff catcher. So when we check the flop here, we're not going to be check folding. That's not really going to be the plan. We're going to either be check raising or check calling, and both of those are fine, as betting would be too. When the 7 turn comes, don't freak out, you know, don't be like, oh no, this is disgusting, and just panic. Yes, this is not a good board for your range, but your opponent has checked back on the flop and their range is going to contain many hands like jack 10, queen 10, queen jack, etc. One of the reasons that we talked about betting flop for was value, and the other one was denial. Both of those things are now less necessary. When villain checks back on the flop, they move away from pocket pairs, hands that beat us, but they also move away from having things like 10-9 of clubs, queen jack, queen 10. These are hands that should bluff the flop pretty frequently. What they move towards is just things that are dominated here. Ace queen, ace jack, stuff like that will check back pretty frequently. So our equity has actually gone up due to the action sequence here, even though this card is clearly like better for villain's range than it is for ours. I find that my students spend far too much time obsessing over who the turn is good for. They almost play the turn as if action sequence isn't relevant, pre-flop ranges aren't relevant, and the only thing that matters is what the 7 does. That's an extremely tunnel vision, short-sighted thought process. It's not that the 7 is irrelevant, but it's certainly far from the be-all and end-all of the spot. I don't think we can value bet now. When our equity goes up and when we move closer to showdown, a couple of things happen. One is that the fold equity we're getting is now less useful than it would have been on the flop. To understand this statement, think about villain having a hand like 10-9 or Jack-10 or Queen-Jack or something like that. And the non-flush draw variance is what I mean here. So imagine villain has Queen-Jack of diamonds. On the flop, that hand is going to have about 23% equity against our ace-king. Don't quote me on that, but it's going to be something like that depending on the suits. On the turn, it's going to have far less. If we cause villain to fold the Queen-Jack of diamonds here, that's way less useful than it would have been on the flop, therefore. The other thing is that because our hand has now been demoted a little bit in terms of its ability to value bet, so the 7 has improved a bunch of other hands in villain's range to being very strong, and it's also left his air very weak, our opponent is now more polarized than you would expect here, and we have an extremely mediocre equity hand. When you have the middle of your range on the turn or on the river, you shouldn't bet. Almost always. There's very, very few situations where you should be betting the middle of your range on the turn or the river when your opponent is playing relatively normally or competently. So this is a very automatic and clear check. Bluffing is out of the question. The hand has far too high a check EV. People say don't bluff with showdown value. That's kind of right, but let's just talk about why that is. When you bluff, you say no thank you to the line of checking. You turn down that line as an option. So when you bluff, you choose a line over checking. If you choose a box over another box, it is important what is in the box that you chose, but it also matters what was in the box that you declined. If I offer you $100 and $200 and you take the $100 because that's a decent amount of money, you're kind of missing the point of comparing your options. So if we were to bet here, while you could formulate some shallow argument like villain checked back the flop, or I'm going to rep an overpair, or my range still has overpairs in it, or I could have ace-4, all of these arguments are garbage, trash, dog shit. Don't use them. Just say I have the middle of my range, I have mediocre equity, I can't value bet, I can't bluff. Done. Simply done. People overcomplicate how to play hands like ace-king when they miss the flop because their heads are swimming with all these nonsensical arguments. So in this situation, you check. It might seem obvious, but I think it's well worth illustrating this because people do make mistakes at this spot. 3 on the river, again, you should assess your equity. There are 3 possibilities here. Either you have enough equity to value bet and consider doing that. Doesn't mean you have to. You could have a mediocre hand that must check due to its mediocrity and just middling equity. In other words, check is worth quite a lot of the pot, so turning the hand into a bluff is worth less than the pot due to the extra risk that's basically taken on when you risk extra money by trying to make your opponent fold. Thirdly, you could say that your hand is so low down that the best thing you can do here is bluff, and that you think the fold equity in this spot, theoretically, or maybe exploitatively, is sufficient for that. Pause the video, have a think about it. What should you do with this hand on the river? Unpause the video. That's right, guys. You nailed it, or at least I hope you did. You should absolutely check here. Doing anything else is crazy. If you bet, you will get close to 0 fold equity against stronger hands. People are not going to this river with pocket 8s to fold. They're not going to this river with pocket 8s in this way in general very frequently, but if they did, they're certainly not doing that to fold very often. I don't think it's impossible that you could get called by ace-queen here if you value bet. I actually think the spot is closer to a value bet than the bluff, but I think it's a check. And I think this is a spot where if you guys are playing like 25 NL or something, you're not playing against crushers like the 200 NL pool. Okay, they're not crushers, but they're very strong compared to 25 NL players. Then you're going to do very well in this spot when you check and face a bet, because villain is going to be extremely capped and over bluffing, not bluffing enough earlier, which means that they take too many of their air combos to the river and then probably over bluffing. So in this example, villain actually had one of the hands we could value bet against on the flop or on the turn or on the river, but we can't be tunnel visioned like that. You can't play against only ace of spades, queen of diamonds, because of course there could also have been some 10-9, Jack-10, Queen-Jack air hands in villain's range. And because villain's range did contain a lot of air still, the check on the river and then just planning to call with this lovely bluff catcher is going to do really well at all stakes. This is an over bluff node. People are not good at delaying their value bets, and they do get here with too much air. So definitely looking to check call that river. Okay, that's